So let me know in chat. You are presented with blank piece of paper scenario. So you are starting something from scratch, let's say in the job that you're doing today. How are you feeling about that? No right or wrong, just really interested to know. How do you sort of feel about, I don't know, you get a brief and it's a complete blank piece of paper. Love it, energized and inspired, a little bit nervous, very daunted, panicking, daunted, excited, panic, confused, vaguely. I like the vaguely terrified. That's my favourite so far, Zoe. Charlotte hates it. Apprehension and enthusiasm. Do you know what my hypothesis for asking this question was? We would get a very wide range of responses, which you can see in the chat. You can see people have a very different response to this. Some people are like, wow, this is the best thing ever. The thing I want most in my day is a blank piece of paper. And there's at least 40% of people here going, nightmare, awful, or at least there's some sort of feelings of apprehension or being kind of daunted. Some people being really optimistic, really, really excited. So full disclosure, I am a lover of the blank bit of paper. I really like the ability to start from scratch. And also I've spent a lot of my career doing that. So I am somebody who does, I've got you're always a little bit daunted, but certainly it gives me energy. I'm excited. I'm very kind of inspired by the blank piece of paper. And so when you're thinking about going from nothing to something, so you're like, right, I've got a blank piece of paper and I've got to turn it into something. I've got to move from nothing to at least having something. What is the first thing you do? So I think this is a really good sort of tool or technique for us all to have. What's the first thing that's going to help you get started? So we've got morning pages, which if people don't know morning pages, that's from, I think it's called The Artist's Way, where you just sort of do some free writing. I think that's usually how that works. You do a brainstorm, you do a mind map. Yeah, I got mind map on my list. Brilliant, Louise. I got this. This is what Helen would do. So if Helen has a blank piece of paper, she would definitely just use ChatGPT. Write something, anything, edit later. I was watching something from I think it was a filmmaker, and they were interviewing him about sort of his first film. And he said the most important thing he learned is that the start of it, the first thing you're going to do is always going to be rubbish. And he was like, once I accepted the first thing I do is going to be rubbish, then it's fine. You expect it to be rubbish, but then you just know you're like, oh, but then the next one will get better. And you sort of, that's part of the process, which often I think we're not maybe used to that. So it's almost like really lowering our standards to get started. So I think that's a good description there. Whether you've seen anything like it before from Charlotte, work out what you're trying to achieve, Kat, great. Think about the why and the purpose. Start with the why. Yeah, so and somebody, they're also going, yeah, except it's going to be a rubbish first draft. Mind maps, free list of ideas. Yeah, this is a good list of what to do to get started, because I often think the most intimidating thing is the first thing. You know, when you are, once you're in, you're like, oh, okay, well, I've got something to work with. Yeah, I love Neil Gaiman. Steve, he's probably one of my favorite authors, and he does say, if you want to be a writer, well, you just sort of have to write. I've read that so many times from people. You're like worrying less about the quality and more about just have you produced something. So the things I came up with in terms of firsts are questions. So do you have some go-to questions? So some of you have described some of those. Francis talking about the 5 W's and the 1 H. So who, what, why, where, when, how. That would be a good structure to start with. I'm a big fan of the problem question. What's the problem I'm trying to solve here? I might also think about outcomes. What does success look like? How do we make this the best project we've ever worked on? So I might have some of those sort of propelling questions. I think having 2 or 3 questions that you keep coming back to is always helpful. You'd all got mind mapping. I had mind mapping. I think sometimes just getting something down on a bit of paper to think about, well, what do I already know? We talked about in the podcast. I think it's actually really helpful to sometimes just write down what you don't know. At least then you're writing something down. You're like, here are all the questions that I've got that need answering. Here are all the things that I don't know. That would be quite a good mind map to do. You could just do a mind map of everything you don't know that you need to find out. Suddenly you've got a list of questions, and then you get into, well, who can help me answer those questions? So I think that will be a useful thing to do. I don't know if this did come up from everybody, so sorry if I missed it. I think the first thing you can do when you have got the blank piece of paper could be a conversation. I think there are things that I do where I think, well, if I've seen someone else do something similar, and I actually did that this morning, whether because this was on my mind, I don't know. But one of the things that we always sort of mull over is, would we ever write a new edition of Squiggly Career? And who knows if we'd ever do it. But it's always on my mind. Like, we've learned quite a lot. There's better ideas that we could put in there. But we'd be starting from scratch. I don't know what it looks like or feels like to write a new edition of something. But I know Kath Bishop, who wrote The Long Win, which is excellent, and she is brilliant. If you've not listened to her podcast on that, she's really good. And I know that she's done it. She's done a second edition of The Long Win. So almost the first thing I would do, if I was doing that very seriously, which we're not right now, I would have a conversation with Kath, because I would go, well, what will take me from a blank piece of paper to something would be talking to someone who's done it before, because I can very specifically identify what is the thing. So it could be a conversation. It could be, this is definitely how I start a lot of the time. What can I read, watch, or listen to? Oh, Long Win is currently free on Audible. Oh, there you go. Great knowledge, Zoe. But I would go to connecting dots in my mind. Have I read an article on this before that I might want to go back to? Is there a podcast I'm going to re-listen to? Sort of trying to immerse myself in the world a bit, sort of spending time exploring or researching before putting any pressure on myself to think, I need to be able to answer some of these questions. So that's probably where I start most of the time. It's interesting, the AI one. I was chatting to Helen this week. So we are writing first drafts at the moment of chapters for Learn Like a Lobster, which I'll talk about later. And the way that Helen and I write first chapters is dramatically different, but we're both doing the same thing. So it's so interesting to see that process. And she was talking me through the first draft she's done for one of the chapters, and also how she got to it. And some of those things I just thought I would never have thought about that. So that's great, because I can try those things out. But we probably do those things in quite different ways, and we very literally have a blank piece of paper to start from. So just think about if you are someone who finds this hard. I think if you enjoy this and you're like me, you probably do lots of these things, and you relish the chance to have a go at these things. If you find this hard, I would say look at those and think which one of those appeals most to you. Would you enjoy having sort of a curious conversation? Do you like questioning? Does that sort of appeal to you? Do you want to have a go at a mind map? Would you be like me and sort of just do some read, watch, listening, just sort of immerse yourself, go into ChatGPT, put some things in? Someone actually got in touch with me yesterday on LinkedIn saying they had put the best career books of the past 10 years into ChatGPT, and that's how they discovered Squiggly Career. And then that's why they got in touch with me. It was a very compelling connection argument. When you're connecting with someone you don't know, obviously it was very flattering. So I was like, obviously I'm going to accept that connection. Then I tried it and I can't get Squiggly Career to come up. So either he was lying or he was putting in something slightly different to me. But anyway, it made me smile. How often do you feel like you're starting from scratch? Do you feel like every day you're like, there's something I'm starting from scratch? Do you feel like it's weekly for you, monthly, or is it much more occasional? If you can do annotation, feel free to put stars on the screen, view options, annotate, stamp, and then star. I didn't ask actually if this was anyone's first PodPlus. Please don't panic if you can't do the annotation. You can always just put your answers in chat, which is easier for some people, but the stars are quite fun. So if you're sitting at your desk and you know how to use the stars, we've put the instructions in chat. Just always interesting just to see how often are you starting from scratch. And we talked about on the podcast this week, there's quite different starting from scratch. There's the big things that we start from scratch, a new job, writing a new book from scratch. They feel like those sort of big examples. But I think the small examples are just as important. You might think, I'm going to start from scratch about how I approach something I've done before. So maybe that's a meeting. Maybe that's how you organize your time. Maybe that's something you already do. I think we called it in the podcast scratch stacking. So you're taking something that you've already got, which is the stacking, and you're sort of taking this starting from scratch approach and putting it on top of that. So this doesn't always have to be that daunting, very blank bit of paper. It could be something that you just think, I want to start from scratch on this because it's not working. It's often a good catalyst to start from scratch. When you've got, we've talked before about knotty moments. When you've got something that's not working, often just sort of taking yourself away and going, well, what would we do if we were starting from scratch? Helen and I do that actually quite often. If if we're finding something frustrating, or if we feel like we're not finding our way through something, we'll both sort of back off where we are today and just go, oh, okay, let's do the blank piece of paper thing and see what we come up with. One really good exercise to do that we've been doing a lot more over the last 6 months when you're starting from scratch is start from scratch with someone else. So if most of the time we're working on these projects or processes with other people, and I think sometimes we can assume where we might go. If you're doing that mind map or the questions, you've got your point of view. If you do the identical exercise with someone else, but don't tell each other what you're going to, what you're writing until you've both done it, and then share your reflections, that can be really fascinating. I think that can move you forward faster. You imagine, let's say, Lucy and I were both working on a project for Amazing If, and we both said, in a meeting, we're both going to start by spending 5 minutes answering the question. We're going to write down the answer to the question. What's the problem we think we're trying to solve here? So rather than talking about it, we're just going to write it for 5 minutes. And then Lucy tells me what she's written. I tell Lucy what I've written. I think that you will find if you do that, you start to realise, you stop things like cross wires, miscommunications. You might go, well, actually, what Lucy's just said hadn't crossed my mind. That actually feels more important than where I thought we were going. And sometimes we don't say these things out loud. And that's where projects often lose their way or get to the messy middle, because I thought we were doing A and actually Lucy thought we were doing B. And none of us, we didn't quite at the start do what are we starting from scratch on? Like, why are we starting from scratch? Using some of those questions, perhaps. So looking at how often we are doing this, for most of us, it's relatively frequent. So we've got quite a lot of kind of weekly, monthly. So this is something that we practice. If you think of this as a practice, something that we practice quite often. What would you do if you started from scratch? Yeah, brilliant, Joanna. Great question when you feel stuck. Exactly that. Anytime you're frustrated, not sure, struggling to find your way through that. I think that's really good. Let me just get rid of those stars. Okay. I also think when you're reflecting on frequency, if you are in occasional, given squiggly careers, changing complexity that we all find ourselves in, if I was you, I would be looking to increase my frequency, because I think this is something where the more you practice it, the better you get. Some of us might naturally just enjoy a blank piece of paper more than others, but I think the majority of us, it's because you've done it quite often. Practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the easier it gets. The more you come up with, oh, this is a technique that I find really helpful. Here are some ways to go from a blank piece of paper, turning nothing into something. So if you have low frequency, maybe one of the things you might want to do this year is start to really proactively spot opportunities to increase that frequency. If you're doing it daily or weekly, you've got loads of opportunity to practice. If it's monthly or occasionally, you might just think, oh, there's small opportunities for me to start from scratch, so I can just get better at this. What do you think are the biggest barriers? So if you're thinking about what gets in the way of starting from scratch, whether that's at the very start or in those early stages of sort of doing something different, what are the biggest barriers? I don't think we've talked about those. And I don't think we actually talked about them loads on the podcast. So I thought it'd be interesting. Yeah, I thought we would get to that. Connecting the dots with our gremlins. So how much is it ourselves getting in our own way? Fear of failure, fear of not being good enough. I can't do it. So getting quite fixed about our capabilities, how much we like things that feel comfortable. It's always pretty uncomfortable. Scope creep, time. Scope creep is a good one. That takes me back to my Sainsbury's days. Time, really practical one. Interesting, Camilla. Time available matched to the quality wanted. So, we need to do something amazing and we need to do it by the end of this week. And you sort of think, well, okay, those expectations don't sort of match the reality. Yeah, constraints is a really good one. If you are faced with constraints and you're starting from scratch, I would go back to Adam Morgan's work. I find his perspective on, well, what am I going to hold on to and what am I going to let go of, really helpful. Also, if you've got short timelines or deadlines, or you feel like there are unrealistic expectations, that's where you get into, that great question from Liz Wiseman on impact players. What's most important now? Or what's most important first? They're the sorts of questions I would be asking if somebody in our team said, we do need this by Friday, and it does feel quite important. And I'm just thinking, okay, well, I can't do this as if I was doing it in a month's time. I would then start to ask some of those questions, like, what am I going to hold on to? What am I going to let go of? What's most important now? Those gremlins getting in the way. People talking about imposter. Also, if you, I've spent quite a lot of time on things like, how do you develop ideas and how do you think about being creative? And I've read a few books about that from people who sort of spend their lives doing this. What is often surprising is there is pretty much always a process. So for anyone who is from a gremlin perspective, holding themselves back, just thinking, oh, I'm just not good at this. I'm not good at developing ideas. I'm not good at starting from scratch. There is literally a book called A Technique for Producing Ideas, where they kind of go, well, this is what I do. Like I break down and I sort of follow the same process every time. And there are 3 or 4 books like that. And that's from people who spend their lives like producing these big ideas that often come out as amazing films or amazing TV ads that you would have heard of. So don't underestimate the value of process. And I sometimes think that feels a bit counterintuitive here, because you feel like, oh, I've got this blank piece of paper. And it's sort of that thing of like, well, I just sit down and write for 90 minutes. I take a break. I sit and write for 90 minutes. That's a process. So don't be afraid of process. And maybe that's something you feel more confident and familiar with. You're like, oh, okay, well, I'm good at that. I'm good at putting some structure. I actually think you do have to usually put some structure around this. Structure around starting from scratch, bringing those 2 things together might just be something to ask yourself. There is. I did an interview with Adam Morgan back when we launched You Coach You, so you can listen to him talking a bit about that, about hold on, let go, those principles. Brilliant. You're all helping each other, so you don't need me. So I think it's always interesting to notice when you are starting from scratch, either what's getting in your way or what's most likely to get in your way. And is it internal versus external factors? Is it me? Am I getting in my own way? Or is it pressure from a manager, pressure from the organization? Is it a practical thing like a time thing? And noticing those things and adapting accordingly. So rather than just either feeling frustrated or feeling bad about it, actually going, well, I recognize that this is half the time that I would ideally like. So therefore, what am I going to do differently? So that you can still kind of follow a process that works and that reflects the reality. We know when we've got constraints or limitations, 3 mindsets we can have. Victim, I feel sorry for myself. This is not fair. I'm going to blame other people. Neutralizer, which would probably be, what I'm going to just do is work really, really long hours so that I can still do this thing. And then you've got transformer, which is, okay, well, I've got this constraint. How am I going to sort of transform my mindset? How could this be even better because we don't have as much time as we'd anticipated? Maybe it helps you to get to a lot of clarity about what's most important. That can be a really good thing. Let's just talk about minimum viable products. So some of you might be absolute experts in this. Certainly if you've read things like Lean Startup or any of the sort of lean approach to work, probably agile a bit, I would guess, but certainly more startup world. They talk a lot about minimum viable products, and in tech, often they use that all the time. I think what's helpful here is to think about you're trying to get the maximum possible knowledge from the minimum possible effort. And I was doing some research on this last night, and they were saying the biggest mistake people make is almost not being specific enough about what does good enough look like. So there is no point doing a minimum amount of effort if you can't test that presentation, idea, project in a way that is meaningful and useful to your stakeholders internally. And I think probably That's the hard bit, personally, because if you're someone who likes everything to be amazing, you could probably start to argue with yourself, well, I need everything to look brilliant to be able to get really good quality feedback. You probably don't, but you need everything to be good enough, because if it's not good enough, then you don't get the feedback loop that you need to then think, well, where will I go next? So I actually think defining what good enough looks like towards the start of a project, if this feels like a useful technique, certainly if this is something you need to test and learn on, is really helpful. And interestingly, so I am someone who loves starting from scratch. I do not enjoy being good enough. So this is where, just because you're good at one of the bits of this doesn't necessarily mean you're good at the other bit. I would definitely keep going for too long. And we did do a podcast on when is good enough great. So if you're like me and you're like, well, what I would do is convince myself that this much effort was needed, whereas actually Helen would tell you it's this much effort that was needed. She is much better at this than I am. It's sort of this prototyping mentality. It's figuring out, well, how much do I need to do to get what I need in return? And I do think you can sort of, to at least an extent, try and hypothesize like what that might look like. So when we were first testing pod sheets, for example, we had that idea, and then very quickly we designed something that was a summary that looked pretty basic, but it did show a summary of the podcast. It had some questions in. We knew you were going to be able to download it and fill it out. And we probably did that within a day. Now I looked at it and went, oh, it looks awful. And it did look awful. And I find that very hard then. But Helen was like, yeah, but it's fine, because everyone will get that it's not going to look like this. But whether it's really nicely branded, whether all the fonts are quite right, whether there's a typo in here is not the important thing. The important thing is, will this pod sheet be useful? And so just doing that, I'm glad you're grateful for pod sheets. You need to be grateful for Helen for like forcing them out quickly. Doing that, you then go, oh, okay, actually, we got lots of feedback, people being like, that's really helpful. It summarized the podcast for me. It gave us enough knowledge to then go on and produce the ones that you see today. So again, sometimes having a bit of a conversation with somebody. If you are someone like me and you find the good enough thing hard, the best thing I've ever done is found someone who's just better at it than me, who acts as a bit of a forcing function. Or like Julia was saying in chat, channel your inner Helen, channel your inner prototyper, and think, well, does it really matter? I find that quite a good question. Or have a bit of a mantra. I always say to myself, I've got to let it go to let it grow. You can see I'm channeling my inner Helen, because that sort of is alliteration that rhymes and sounds very cheesy, but I'm like, that feels like Helen. Helen would say that sentence. I'm never going to say that sentence, but if that means that I share something, that's probably good enough. So maybe MVP is quite a good thing to think about. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if you've ever watched Austin Kleon's TED Talk. I rewatched it last night. I really like his newsletter, and I love Steal Like an Artist, Show Your Work, all really good. I really like the way he communicates. And he is really interesting because he talks about this idea of copying. And what we are not saying is to kind of copy and paste. So we're not saying, well, look at what they do, just sort of do the same, because that will never be effective. It will never be kind of your version. If you watch his TED Talk, he talks about how he kind of came up with his version of sort of creative writing. What he does is he takes a newspaper article, and what he did in his early days of work is he blanks out bits like this. So you're just left with certain words. And those words might say, Sarah has an amazing something. So he kind of makes interesting copy from existing copy. And he did this and got accused of, like, people were like, people have already done this. Are you like stealing from somebody else's idea? It's not original. And then he sort of looked into the history of ideas, and no idea is original. Because even if you think it is, you've still been influenced and you've still connected dots consciously or unconsciously by things you've seen before. And there are other people who do work a bit like this. I mean, when he talks about it, they still look different. It doesn't take away from his work. So what this is being smart about who are you copying, when are you copying, where are you copying from? It's not about lifting and dropping. It's more about spending time in places that are then going to inspire you when you are starting from scratch. So if I think now about, I was saying to our team yesterday, funnily enough, when you start to write a book, I would say the amount of books you read goes up threefold. So that's smarter copying. So suddenly I am reading loads more nonfiction books because I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, who knows a bit more about this than I do? What does that mean in our language, in a squiggly world? Do I think that's useful? Do I think that's unhelpful? Sometimes it's about what you don't like as much as what you do like. Yeah, that's really nice. You're borrowing, but you're doing it in your own way. And I think there's a big difference between just sort of trying to be something that you're not. There is only one version of Squiggly Careers doing it in our way, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we do that I've seen other people take and do differently, and that being just as useful. So I think it's often useful to know, like, well, who do you want to do some smart copying from? And it's funny, like I think Helen and I were talking about this before the podcast. We had very different reactions to this. I was like, I feel really comfortable with this, and I think other people find this idea of copying, maybe a bit more tricky to get your head around.